Welcome, everybody. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a really special edition of Afikra Conversations for two reasons. One, because I'm joined by my co-host, Sarah Graf, who is calling in from New York, and because we have the incomparable Zainab Bahrani, who is going to be joining us. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Sarah Graf, who is an associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. In 2006, Sarah was a Hagop Kevorkian Curatorial Fellow. She earned her PhD from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts in 2012 with a dissertation on the Mesopotamian Dima Humbaba. Sarah, I'm going to ask you and Zainab to unmute yourself, and I'll pass it over to Sarah to introduce Zainab.
Thank you so much, Mikey. And it is such a great privilege to be talking to Zainab today. I'm going to read you a list of her extensive accomplishments and embarrass her, but I also have to say, just speaking as myself, that she's my mentor and she's the one who made sure that I wrote that dissertation on Humbaba. And she has been my touchstone in so many things. So it is a true privilege to get to talk to her. Zainab Bahrani is the Edith Porada Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University in New York. And she's a specialist in the art and archaeology of ancient Mesopotamia and the Eastern Mediterranean. She's the author of numerous books, including Women of Babylon, Gender and Representation in Mesopotamia, which was published in 2001, The Graven Image, Representation in Babylonia and Assyria in 2003, Rituals of War, the Body and Violence in Mesopotamia, published in 2008, which won the American Historical Association's James Henry Breasted Prize. Her most recent book, The Infinite Image, Art, Time, and the Aesthetic Dimension in Antiquity, is based on her 2010-2011 Slade Lectures in the Fine Arts at the University of Oxford, and it was the winner of the Lionel Trilling Prize in 2015. She's also been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards for her research, including a 2003 Guggenheim and awards from the Getty Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the Kevorkian Foundation. She has been a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in my department before I was a curator there, at paving the way as she has done in so many things, and has conducted archaeological fieldwork in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And she's currently the director of a Columbia University field project, mapping Mesopotamian monuments. So I hope we'll get the chance to dig into some of those really rich topics in our conversation. And I'll turn it over to Mikey to ask the first question.
Thanks, Sarah. Zainab, first of all, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you for that amazing introduction, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to see you and to chat with you. I mean, really a pleasure, because I always enjoy our conversations so much.
Zainab, I have a question for you.
Yes.
So you grew up in Iraq. But most people who grew up in Iraq are not necessarily drawn into studying the history of Mesopotamia and the history of its monuments. How quickly in your life, how early on in your life did you become sort of attracted to this study? What drew you into this work?
Well, that's actually a very easy question to answer for me, because I was drawn to it at a very, very young age, because I was fortunate enough to be born into a family where my mother and my aunts especially were fascinated by the ancient sites, and they would take us as children to the Iraq Museum and to sites like Babylon or Hatra. And I still remember vividly, as if it were yesterday, the first time I saw Babylon. I must have been 5 or maybe 6 years old, probably more like 5. And I was just astounded by this place, the dragons and the bulls, and just the way that they emerged out of the brickwork there. And I kept asking questions to all the adults. What is this place? How did it get here? Who made it? And the way that I see it is that I just never stopped asking those questions.
This is sort of part of the value of taking your kids to museums and to archaeological sites. But, you know, Zainab, you mentioned that it was your mother and your aunts, and I had the privilege to know at least one of your aunties, sort of Lamia al-Gailani. And I'm wondering to what extent it was women who shaped that investigation, and what I feel like that is a topic that doesn't get discussed enough, the important role of Iraqi women in shaping relations with cultural heritage.
Absolutely. I mean, it was certainly something that was driven or guided by the women that I had the great privilege of growing up amongst. And I'm very aware of that privilege and good fortune that I had. And yes, I mean, in front of me were women like Dr. Lamia al-Gailani, who was an auntie to me, and the Iraqi archaeologist, Dr. Salma al-Radi, who has now passed away, and who coincidentally lived in Beirut for a while. For those of you who were in Beirut, some of you may even know who she is. So they paved the path, because it was wonderful to be able to see when I was a young girl that this was a possibility, that women could become archaeologists, that this was not a world that was closed to someone like me. In fact, it was never a point of discussion, because in my family, it was always taken for granted that, yes, of course, a girl could go on to graduate school. And of course, a girl could become an archaeologist. So this was never a point of discussion, because others had paved the path, and I'm so grateful to them.
So Zainab, so my role in this interview is largely to be the dumb one. And so I'm going to ask questions that maybe folks who have never studied archaeology might want to ask. So I'm going to ask a really basic question. Why is it valuable, if you were explaining to a 15-year-old, why is it valuable to understand monuments, to study them, to protect them? Why do people care? Why should we care about this practice to begin with? What can it tell about ourselves, our society today, our priorities, the priorities of our ancestors? Why should we care about this stuff?
Well, I mean, for me, the caring for the past, if we just live in the present and know nothing about the past, then of course we'll make horrendous mistakes. But the past is also about who we are. It has to do with our sense of place and belonging in the world. You'll notice that I'm avoiding the word identity, and I'm doing so on purpose, because I'm very much against kind of ethno-nationalist identity and relationships to antiquities in that way. I don't personally participate in that direction. But I think for all of us, monuments and architectural history, architectural heritage gives us a sense of space, a sense of a location. And we can include in that the historical landscape in general. So how do we situate ourselves within our world and where we fit within that world? I think that architectural heritage and monuments certainly give us that sense of place. So I think that it's very important to care for those things and to conserve them where possible. I also think that people do become tied to these, especially, for example, historical architecture. People's sense of self very often becomes tied with it, and you can see how it can be easily on the reverse, or conversely, be used as a way of wiping out the memory of people. So that's why we have to care.
Building on that a little bit further, so I feel like we've already started to touch on this, but you preserve in your intellectual lineage this history of women being in the forefront of the intellectual life of Iraq, for instance, which is an important piece of history, is an important piece of the past that, as you say, you know, there are forces working to actively erase this, to fit this into a narrative of repression or of gender oppression that is not actually borne out by the evidence. And I feel like your work with mapping Mesopotamian monuments, which we'll get to certainly in the talk, is likewise an attempt to preserve this complexity and to counteract these stories. And I'm wondering, because it seems like these narratives are very powerful, these narratives of kind of oppression and cultural impoverishment are really powerful. And I'm wondering what you think about the role of storytelling for someone who is primarily an academic, but you do engage in storytelling as well.
Well, I mean, and I think that's such a great question. Thank you, Sarah. And the role of storytelling, I think that I'm becoming more and more kind of attracted to that direction as I get older. I think when I was younger, I felt very strongly that the academic work had to prove that I knew my material, that I, had a control of the kind of scientific data and was doing it according to a correct methodology. But as I get older, I allow myself more the form of telling it as a story. And I do think that that can help. But everything comes in its own time. And I don't feel that what I do today can be the same as what I did 20 or 25 years ago. Everything is in its own time. But you're quite right about women of Babylon, because what's happened with the kind of the academic narrative about the role of women in the ancient Near East or in Near Eastern antiquity is that it's been presented as a kind of a devolution of from more free to more and more oppressed, and then reaching Islam when women become allegedly very oppressed. So there is this story that's been told that I was arguing against, and saying that it's not just a matter of finding the positivist data from the past and compiling it in a catalog and showing it to the world, but it's really questioning the way that history has been told, where aspects are cherry-picked to narrate a kind of a single line that of not evolution, but devolution, if we can use that term. So there have been a lot of Orientalist stereotypes that have been used in explaining the material from the ancient Near East. For example, if there's a particular word that's difficult to read, the Assyriologist may read it as a veil, whereas I would look at it and say, I don't really see where the word veil comes in here. And are you working with a kind of a stereotype of expecting something like that in this sentence? So I wanted to show how the writing of history is always influenced by our own time and by our own preconceptions in the places and periods in which we work, and also to try to tell the story of ancient Near Eastern women in a more positive light.
Zainab, it's funny. Sarah and I were talking about your work briefly, and I think I mentioned this on the call when I had with you, which is that you have this huge body of work that sort of spread over decades, and I'm always curious. If you were rewriting this book, for example, Women of Babylon now, how would it be different? How would you have, advised your former self on what to look at differently at the time, or given if you had this 20 more years of information available to you? What do you think you got kind of wrong? What new and or not so right? And what do you think, how would you have changed this book if you were to approach it now?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that, of course, there's always new material that emerges in the archaeological field, and new scientific information that I certainly would add if I had it to do over again. But looking, I mean, in fact, I recently used it for teaching just this year with my graduate students. And it was funny rereading it because now it's 20 years later and it's almost like reading a book by a different person. So that was actually quite amusing. What I would say to my younger self is be brave, a little bit more brave about the critiques that the sort of critiques of Orientalism that I raised. I would tell myself to be even more brave about foregrounding those, because at the time that I brought them up 20 years ago, this was not a popular way to work. And nowadays, everybody's speaking about racial justice and decolonizing the museum and so on. And this is, in fact, what I was trying to do with those publications. But I was really doing that on my own and getting very little support. So I would tell my younger self, be braver about this, because things will change.
People will catch up.
Yes, things will change.
Yeah,
that, you bring to mind, Zainab, a very famous quote from Toni Morrison, where she talks about how the real function of racism is distraction, and that, racism forces you, and here she's speaking in her particular you as an African-American woman, to prove that your people had history, to prove that your anatomy is not defective, to prove that your people had art. And you develop all these disciplines to argue against this. And she said, there will always be another question. Do your own work. Don't be distracted.
Exactly.
And I just, that is the advice that you're giving yourself in 2001.
Yes, don't be distracted. People will always try to tell you, no, that's not what everybody else is doing. This is not the direction to go. There are always a lot of naysayers, but I think you have to follow what you think is the right path.
And that speaks to what you were saying about how you were very insistent on doing things, in the correct way with the correct methodology, because you were already pushing so hard against these established kind of barriers, that to do them in a way that you are now able to do with more of an insistence on narrative or on storytelling was impossible. So in a way, like, you could write this book twice, but you couldn't write this book again without having written it 20 years ago.
I see what you're saying, because I think it's true that everything has to come in its own time. And as my students all know, I'm really pedantic. I'm a stickler. I'm a perfectionist. I'm a stickler for detail. I will go after them if even, one footnote is missing, one small detail, because I think that if we're going to make these sorts of critiques of Orientalism and so on, that then our scholarship has to be so airtight. It has to be so, the armor has to be strong, because there are always people who are going to try to tear it down any way they can. So I think that for myself, and I've tried to pass down this habit to my students, as Sarah knows, that we have to do this. We have to be really solid academically in order to make these sorts of criticisms.
But can I ask you also to tell a story? Because I think, of course, you're absolutely right. One must be rigorous in scholarship. Otherwise, everything that you're building your work on is not solid. But I think in some cases, it's also a case of being able to see what has been visible forever, but that no one has bothered to see it before. So I'm asking you, if you're comfortable telling the story, to tell your encounter with this nude female statue created during the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbel-Kala that we have on the screen, and the thing that you saw that no one had seen.
Well, yes, okay. This is a kind of a funny and strange story. So in my earlier work, I started studying the representation of the female nude and thinking about how ancient cultures represented the nude female body, whether in ancient Greece or Rome or the Near Eastern world. And I studied them systematically for some time. And this particular statue in the British Museum, it's from the 11th century BC. I was always kind of intrigued by it because it looked to me as if it was kind of roughly modeled, or at least this is how it survived through the centuries. But it has an inscription on the back. And I just thought, well, having looked at all of the other representations of female nudes, one thing that really struck me as a graduate student, as a young woman, is that in ancient Near Eastern representations of the female body, the pubic triangle is always represented very carefully. It's never kind of skimmed over or avoided. Whereas in classical Greek art, of course, we don't see it. It's skimmed over and avoided. So I became intrigued by the question of why these representational choices were made. And I thought, well, why doesn't this statue, this kind of blows my theory, this statue, because I couldn't see that the pubic triangle was represented at all, until finally one day I went to the British Museum and looked at it close up. And as I was looking carefully, I realized that there were these finely carved curls of hair in little snail curls carved all across the area of the pubic triangle. And it felt like such a victory to find. I thought, yes. And the guard in the gallery, I think, thought I was completely out of my mind because I started taking photographs of this detail. But I was so delighted because, of course, it proved my theory was correct. And then I wrote about it in this article in the mid-1990s called The Hellenization of Ishtar, which was a comparison between representations of Ishtar and Aphrodite, basically. But I think one thing that I would like to stress, because I don't want people to get the wrong impression about this, is in that article and in my work in Women of Babylon, I never wanted to say that somehow Greek classical art was inferior or that it was not as realistic as the Near Eastern examples. What I was trying to argue is that each culture had its own way of constructing an ideal femininity in representation. Neither of them are realistic. Both of them are ideals of female beauty and femininity, and each region or culture represented a particular idealized form. So this is what I was trying to show, to contextualize them like that. I just want to add that in a recent exhibition in the British Museum, speaking of decolonizing the museum, the last exhibition that they had in the British Museum couple of years ago, Sarah will know better than I do, they described this statue as being very unattractive and maybe deliberately unattractive. And I seriously don't see that. I don't understand why they're saying that. And in fact, the inscription on the back says that it was made by the king Ashur-bel-kala, and he actually uses the plural form, that he made these statues really, and the term that's used is for visual pleasure.
I think that that's a very radical assessment. And again, it's sort of, I think I see this thread coming through in our conversation now of noticing things and taking seriously things that were always there to be apprehended, but were never taken seriously. Maybe the person who wrote the label found this to be an unattractive statue, but it was made for pleasure. And if we take that seriously, then what does that mean in terms of the relational web spinning out from the statue to the the people who were meant to see it and the people who made it.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, of course, people have different attitudes towards all sorts of works of art, and any two people may like or dislike a particular work of art. But as a way of guiding viewership within a museum context, it's my belief that the curator bears a different kind of a responsibility. It's one thing if we're strolling through and chatting, and a friend of mine might say, well, I don't really like that piece. But I think it's a museum curator has a different kind of a role, or maybe a burden to bear. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what you think of that, Sarah, because you're working as a curator.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge responsibility to show when it's your voice that's being used. That's something that I take very seriously, and I think curators do well to take seriously, that when you write a label, there's no author. So paradoxically, it becomes more powerful because it is just sort of information that's here.
Right.
No one wrote it, it's given by God, you know? And I think that this is another thing that is interesting to explore when talking about ancient Near Eastern art. I mean, as you well know, there's this long history of erasing the hand of the maker when you are making, in particular, a divine image.
Right.
I think that we would do well to remind ourselves that we're not so different, that, you know, as viewers, we also feel on some level comforted often by this sense that no one made this, it's just handed to us. And the act of showing the making troubles that, because it shows that this is constructed.
Right. And museums are institutions that are quite powerful in establishing narratives of how people understand the past. So I think that's something to think about. But the idea of a work of art in antiquity just kind of being made on its own and being a presence in the world, I find that fascinating. In its own context, that for the ancients, a work of art was not just a representation of something in their environment, but it was as a living being, something as a living being. And it was a form of presence in the world. And I've always found that to be fascinating.
Zainab, I'm curious, just for time purposes, I want to move on to talk about your project mapping Mesopotamia. One of the things that I found most fascinating about this project, as I was reading about it and learning about it, was this idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you think I'm misdescribing it, but this idea that there are politics associated with the destruction of monuments as well as the preservation of monuments. And there are political acts, and understanding those acts, understanding how the monuments are a part of our past, but preserving them or destructing them is an opportunity to shape the future. And so these are important places to understand, and the motives of those who are trying to preserve them and the motives of those who are trying to destroy them are also really important to understand. Is that something, first of all, am I describing it correctly?
You're describing it,
and B,
yes, you're describing it correctly, but what I would add is that this is such a complicated topic because yes, I mean, we all know about the unfortunate recent cases of the really heartbreaking recent cases of the destruction, and I don't even want to give them the credit of mentioning what they did. So I don't even like to talk about it. So what I would say is that perhaps people are more aware of the dangers of iconoclasm, meaning the destruction of images. People are aware of that today. But I think what people don't often think of is how aspects of preservation and conservation can also become politicized, as in who has the right to decide what institutional structures and authorities make those decisions, what are the materials used, what can be done. Of course, history is always a process that's both remembering and forgetting. There are always selective processes that take place, right? And so we work on conservation and preservation of things like historical architecture and monuments, but we also have to remember that specific choices have to be made, that not everything is being preserved. In the previous slide that you showed, Amedi in Turkish, the rock relief, and you see the man walking down the stairway path. I want to point out that that stairway path dates to the Parthian period. That means around the time of Christ in the Roman era. It's a very ancient stairway path, and people have been walking up and down that stairway path for a couple of thousand years now, and it's part of their day-to-day existence. I've worked there a lot in the past 7 or 8 years, and it's just a wonder to me how this is such a major part of the lives of the people of Ahmadiyya. And the rock reliefs were integrated into the medieval Islamic citadel. They weren't destroyed, they weren't removed, they were just integrated into the medieval Islamic citadel. And to me, this was a really fascinating aspect.
Yeah, I think that we could kind of try and weave together a few things that we're talking about. If we talk about what Mikey was, I think, sketching out, like the politics of preservation and what does it mean to preserve something? So for instance, if the Ahmadiyya citadel was being preserved in a Western sense, maybe that man would not be allowed to walk up and down the steps anymore. Maybe that relief would be separated from, it's right out there. People can touch it, people can lean on it, people can, do whatever they want. So it's really striking to me. It makes me think of an example that I learned of recently where there's a shrine called the Kifl outside of Babylon, which I'm sure Zainab knows, that it's a tomb of the prophet Ezekiel is in that shrine and madrasa. And the outer area was recently restored. And when they restored the minarets, they found that there were bricks from the time of Nebuchadnezzar that had been used to kind of patch up the minarets. And I love that because I love the palimpsest nature of the relationship with the place, with Babylon, with, this whole region being tied together. But, would then that brick be removed and then placed in a museum? What are the different impulses behind each of these relationships? Like, is there a way to preserve something while also allowing it to still be an organic part of its environment?
Yes, I think those are such important questions, really. And I've been working on this project, mapping Mesopotamian monuments, for what is it now, 7 or 8 years already. One thing that struck me is how everything is a kind of a living historical monument, that one thing is kind of built into another, and you see that relationship between different eras and time periods, and the way that people live with it. They spend their daily lives interacting with it. I think sometimes when sites become official heritage sites, we lose that because they're somehow sanitized, they're roped off, they serve the heritage industry, which is really for tourism, and they become museumified so that they're no longer parts of people's lives. And I always think that that's a great pity, because there's something very beautiful about seeing them there as they have been for thousands of years, and that people in the community have known that they were there and more or less lived with them as part of their environment. So there are sometimes, decisions that are taken either for the sake of the protection of the monument in terms of turning it into a heritage site, or for, as I said, for the tourist industry. And I think the kind of rise of the heritage industry as something that's for a consumer, as a consumer item is a sort of a pity, because it disassociates the so-called heritage from the people, and it turns it into a commodity. And I'm not a big fan of that approach, although of course I participate in the world of tourism and I go to visit sites in many countries, so I enjoy it as everybody else does, but we should be aware that we sometimes do this. However, then development also sometimes destroys things, as we know. Is in a place like Lebanon, where many of you are today, you're all very aware of that development can destroy heritage buildings, heritage architecture, pathways, roadways, even natural environments. And that's always, to me, so heartbreaking. I mean, we know, for example, shall I mention the beautiful site of Hasan Cave in southeastern Turkey, which has recently been flooded by the creation of a dam. It's on the Tigris River, so on the Tigris, where it starts in Turkey. So a dam was built, and this amazing, beautiful site that we documented in 2015. What we're looking at now is the mosque, the old mosque, the Ulu Jami, the old mosque of Diyarbakir, which is one of the most beautiful mosques on earth. So for me, the two most beautiful mosques, it is a hard question that I'm asking myself, but among my favorite mosques are the Great Mosque of Damascus, which is astonishingly beautiful, really like drop dead gorgeous, as they say. And the other one is the Ulu Jami of Diyarbakir, which is also really astoundingly beautiful. I mean, as an archaeologist, of course, I love both of those mosques in the way that they integrate antiquity into the mosque, and they show a continuity of culture through the millennia that, to me, is so beautiful and that I appreciate so much. So very near to here is the site of Hasan Cave, which was flooded. And that was an amazing, amazing site. And it's a pity to lose it. And it was, for example, a major site on the Silk Road. It was a place where silk came from places like Mosul and Iraq, stopped in Hasan al-Cave, and that was a place of exporting silk and textiles to Venice. So it was a major exporter of textiles to Europe. And so for the entirety of the history of that region, of our region, is such a sad thing that we've lost that historical place.
So Sarah, I want to jump in and ask you our sort of quick Q&A and then move into the town hall section, because we got a bunch of really good questions in the chat. I'm going to try to keep the answers relatively short. So our first question is, what are you reading or watching right now?
Oh, so that's a funny question. What I'm reading right now is a book by the American Vietnamese author Viet Thanh Nguyen is his name. And the book is called The Sympathizer. It came out a couple of years ago and it won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm really interested in this book because it's about Vietnamese expats and the kind of the legacy of the Vietnam War in the United States, and what it's like to live in exile and to be diasporic. And of course, for me, there are so many, it resonates so much with being an Iraqi, with the Iraq wars that came afterwards. So I'm really interested in what he's written. And I also think, I mean, again, this is not a call to arms or anything, but for myself, I think it's good to form allegiances with other people living. I mean, I know many of you are in the Middle East and this doesn't apply to you, but as an Iraqi who lives in the United States, it's for me very important to form allegiances with others who have had similar experiences who are not necessarily Middle Eastern.
Yeah, the shared humanity is always nice to bask in. Okay, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I wish that could be possible. And of all the people who lived in history, of course, it would have to be somebody from the past, because I wouldn't want to shadow anybody in the present. But in the past, I'd really love to shadow my own great-grandmother.
Mm.
I would love to shadow my own great-grandmother. I knew her when I was a small child. I remember her well. But of course, I was too young to ask her the right questions. And I wish I had had the presence of mind or the time to have asked her all of these questions about what it was like for her to experience that life. She lived during the last decades of the Ottoman Empire. She saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. She saw the British invasion into Iraq. I just wonder what it was like for her to be a young woman in those days.
Great. Okay, next is, what do people most misunderstand about your work?
I think we've been speaking about that. I think Sarah and I kind of went over some of the main points with what I feel people misunderstand about my work is I think the larger goal or aim of my work. I mean, it's never been about compiling the positivist data about the past, but it's always been about really decolonizing the field of Near Eastern archaeology and its practices.
For sure. Great. And our last one is, whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
Well, two people come to mind. One is the archaeologist Salma Al-Radi, who I already mentioned. She was an amazing archaeologist who passed away recently. She's the person who restored and conserved the Amariya Madrasa in Yemen. And she did it in an amazing way, because rather than bringing expensive experts from the West, she found the oldest usta bricklayer in the neighborhood, and she hired him to train the young men who were without work. And she basically revived the method of making bricks and building that was local. They preserved the madrasa and the mosque that way. And I just found that approach to be such a good way to go. And she was just a fascinating and brilliant woman and fantastic archaeologist. On the academic side, I have to mention the late Edward Said, because like for so many people like me, people with my kind of background who became academics, he opened the doorway. He opened a path that allowed us to question the received knowledge and the narratives. He allowed us to kind of analyze discourse and to say, well, wait a minute, why is this written like in this way? Why is it written like that? So he'll always remain one of my heroes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, so now we're going to turn it to the group. I think we have our first question from Cameron. We have 5 questions in line. If I can ask everyone to be quite quick with your questions, and we'll try to get everybody in. Cameron, you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bahrani. This has been a wonderful chat and very inspiring. I have a question about how you began the talk in a very high-level way about talking about your work being important for a sense of place and belonging. And my question is how you separate that in the modern world from ethnographic nationalism and state structures, which are unavoidable. How do you separate the politics of preservation from your work?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question, because it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I think that the politics of preservation is always there, and I struggle against it myself almost on a daily basis. And with this kind of ethno-nationalism that's on the rise in all sorts of places, I think that we can. I mean, I'm not that much of a pessimist. I have to believe that we can work towards separating those things. And sometimes when I'm out in the field in a faraway location, those things just seem so distant. I mean, I think in the cities, we think about them a lot more. But there, I certainly believe, otherwise I wouldn't be able to continue with my work, that there will be a way of continuing to speak out against those directions and to try to show a next generation that there's another direction to take here.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. Next up is Yasmin.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for your authenticity and for being so generous with your time this evening. I was wondering how your knowledge of the Babylonian way of life has shaped your everyday life now, and perhaps if you could share any teachings about how they lived their lives that may enrich our lives today.
What a wonderful question. And because I think most people think, well, it's just some, scholarly academic thing and that we don't think about that. But I know that Sarah shares this craze with me. And in the first place, all of you, in fact, participate. Those of you who are Middle Eastern, you're participating in it already, I would say. Because, for example, the way that we wear amulets, the way we say, that this eye bead is to protect you, or this color turquoise keeps you safe, or you put it on your baby. So these are things that come down to us from Babylonian antiquity, and that we do continue the interest in the stars and the cosmos and nature. So I think the thing that I take with me from the Babylonians is a kind of a reverence for nature, that in a kind of an almost a religious way, that this is the manifestation of the gods, and that we should have a reverence for it. And I think that's a good thing to learn from them, especially in today's world.
Okay, the next question is Nadine, but she's under the weather, so I'm going to read it for her. What are your thoughts on the current debates around restitution, and what are some methods towards the decolonizations of museums?
Again,
Yara has another question related that she'll add on to it.
Really, that's such a great question. My feeling about restitution is that things ought to return. I mean, for me, the Elgin marbles so obviously and clearly should be returned to Athens. And I just don't really see how an argument can be made against that. So in many cases, I am for the restitution of things, especially things that were taken during moments of colonial violence. For example, they were literally taken as war booty during combat. For example, Benin, things from Benin. In certain cases, there's really no question that they should be returned. And I've heard the argument that places in the so-called third world, they don't have museums that can care for them, that they don't, have institutions that can protect them. But I think that's nonsense. I think things should go back if they were these illicit ways, then they should go back, certainly.
Great. Yada, you want to ask your question, which is a follow-up?
Yes, so it's a follow-up. Hi, thank you for your talk. It's a question to both Sarah and Zainab. What do you think about, I went to the Met's current exhibit, Making of the Met, and there's this little plaque about partage, and yeah, do you think it's okay to just put that little thing and then it makes it okay and you can just continue business as usual? So that, I just want to hear your thoughts, both of you, on that.
Well, I think that Sarah, as she works in the institution, has to perhaps have a different way of responding to this than I do. So I will say, Partage was a very problematic part of the history of archaeology. I'm not for partage. The reason that I'm saying is I'm not for partage is that there are actually museum directors today who are calling for a return to partage. And partage is a colonialist, imperialist attitude towards cultural heritage. The idea is that cultural heritage items are better off with Western or European people. So I'm completely and totally against the idea of reviving partage. I think museums need to own up to their past, and even in the cases where they're not going to return objects, I think they at least need to be honest and upfront about their own histories, because it's not going over our heads. We see, I mean, as you saw and noticed, we do see and notice, we are aware of what's going on. So the least we expect from museums is that they are transparent about their own histories.
And I would say, if I can add to that, is I'd say hiring folks like Zainab and Sarah to help shape the work of those places helps a lot.
Yes.
I'm gonna, Sarah, do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
I was part of the large committee that wrote that text panel, Yara. I'm glad that you read it. I'm glad it made it onto the wall.
Yeah, I read both.
And you're totally right. And I agree with you completely. And I agree with what Zainab said. She and I have talked about this. And it's a very frustrating bind to be in, because it did feel important to at least address partage. But as you point out, the little plaque, it's not enough.
It's to the side.
It's to the side, right. It's very hard to think of how to make these changes. And I think we're often stuck between incremental change and large scale change. And I really don't know the answer, but I am reminded of Frantz Fanon wrote that decolonization is never a process that happens with nobody noticing. And so I think the Met would do well to be brave and realize that we're not going to be able to do this with nobody noticing. And then all of a sudden, poof, we're decolonized. You have to do it in public view. So you're right.
For sure. Before we keep on going, Zainab, do you have time for one more question?
I will take it.
Okay. We'll take the last one. Jazia, do you want to ask your final question? Before you do, I'm just going to leave the slides up. Please give us feedback as you wait. Before we jump off, I'll cut off my ending. So Jazia, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bahrani. This has been a really wonderful talk. I wanted to ask about something that we're going through in the contemporary moment in the US, which is this major reckoning with monuments from slavery and from our racist past and, even present. So as an archaeologist, how do we deal with monuments that we now identify as representations of hate? And what's our responsibility to the future to, either preserve or destroy or contextualize these kinds of monuments?
This is a really complicated question, but in terms of the monuments of hate that have been coming down, whether they have to do with slavery or colonialism, I think that it's really good that they're coming down. My own perspective is that they should be stored someplace for future study. In some, they need to be archived somehow so that future historians can be aware that these are things that were put up in a celebratory way at a certain point, and it's something to be aware and yes, ashamed of, that these things did happen, and they should be kept. I mean, I remember working in Iraq in 2003, 2004, when all of the Saddam statues came down, and I kept saying, please don't melt them down, put them someplace, because future historians will study them, not because they were beautiful works, but because they're works of oppression, right? And how representation is used for oppression. And so we do need to be able to study those at a certain point, but we don't need to look at them in the middle of our city square. That I don't see at all.
I really love the idea that these could maybe be archived in their defaced state. Like, I love when the monuments get decapitated, get tagged with graffiti, get paint splashed on them. I think that that is part of how that history needs to be recorded. Not merely these were quietly, pulled off stage with nobody noticing. So again, the process doesn't work if nobody notices it. And as Zainab has written on the defacement of ancient Mesopotamian monuments, and I think it's a very apt comparison, because you need to mark that resistance somehow on the monument.
Yeah, they're not precious, right? They're not fragile things. They're supposed to tell the story of who we are. So if we just little heritage sites that are protected in a glass box, they don't tell that story anymore, and they cease to be useful going forward. Zainab, this was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a huge thrill, a real pleasure to have you on. And Sarah, thanks so much for helping make this happen. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope everybody enjoyed it. If you're interested in connecting with Zainab, you can literally just search her name and you will find the Mapping Mesopotamia Monuments website. You'll find all of her books where you find books. And if you're interested in connecting with us as afikra, you can find us, our podcast, our YouTube page, our website. And if you're interested in supporting this work, please consider becoming one of our Patreon supporters to help keep these events plentiful and open to everybody and help us build our online archive. Okay, everybody, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, night, evening, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.